India is the world's largest democracy with a population of more than 1.2 billion people. It's also an incredibly diverse place where people speak more than 100 different languages. It's home to both world-beating technology companies as well as tens of millions of people who live in traditional farming communities much as their ancestors did hundreds of years ago. The media environment in India reflects its diversity. There are 90,000 different print publications and more than 700 TV stations, and there is vibrant debate and criticism of government policies. But on a number of fronts, the freedom of expression and freedom of the press in India is facing threats. Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his Hindu Nationalist Party have accused 3 television companies of violating broadcasting regulations for their reporting on a terrorism case. Books deemed offensive to Hinduism have been pulled from bookshelves and authors threatened. Journalists routinely face threats, particularly in the countryside. At least 6 have been killed this year, according to the International Federation of Journalists. On this edition of Global Journalist, a look inside India's ongoing struggle with press freedom and how things look for the future. We've got a packed show today. We're going to start with Shubhranshu Chowdhury from the city of Raipur in central India. He's a Knight International Journalism Fellow working to train citizen journalists in rural India. Before that, he was a BBC South Asia producer for more than 10 years. Mr. Chowdhury, welcome to Global Journalist.
Thank you.
Tell us just a little bit about some of the communities that you work in. How do people live and how do they get their information about the outside world?
It was very interesting. You talked about hundreds of television stations, thousands of newspapers. You didn't mention radio. You said India is the world's biggest democracy, and I'm sure you will be surprised to know that we have only one radio station which can do news in this huge country where a huge majority can get information only through radio, because we have, as you very rightly said, the smartest people in Mumbai, in Bangalore, and Delhi, but in the middle of the country where I am sitting, we have more than 100 million people who are from indigenous communities, and they have no voice. They speak hundreds of languages, as you very rightly said. There are no communication platforms in those languages. So things have deteriorated in recent past, or in the days we are
Well, let me stop you there because I did want to ask, now you mentioned that in the center of the country there are millions of people, many of whom aren't literate or illiterate, and so radio is sort of their main source of information, particularly state radio, which is the only authorized news broadcaster. So what effect does that have on sort of democracy and governance in these areas?
Biggest democracy, but it is democracy for rich. The only way to listen to anything, they can't read and write, they don't have electricity even to have television, and that don't broadcast in their languages. And whatever we have in the name of free journalism is completely funded by either corporates or the government. In the state I'm sitting, every newspaper and television station gets 70% or more funding from the government. And even in cities of Mumbai and liberated areas of Bangalore and Delhi, 99% of contribution to run this free press comes from a very small number of people, which we call advertisement. So this whole idea of independent journalism is a big suspect.
Well, tell us just a little bit about this project that you're working on in rural India and that you've been working on for a number of years. What are the goals of that?
India is still a rural country. Still around 70% people live in rural India. But if you look at mainstream media, they do not give even 2% space to this huge number of people. So what we are trying to do is to put things upside down. What we have so far is only a top-down, one-way, city-centric media. Can we have democratic media where people tell their own stories? We have mobile phone now reaching almost every villages in India. If we connect mobile phone with internet and radio, we can create a democratic model of communication like we have in politics. We just changed a government 2 days back where Mr. Modi had a humiliating defeat. But the same thing we need to do in journalism. We need democratization of media, which is possible by linking these three technologies. But as I said before, unfortunately, we are world's biggest democracy, but we do not have radio.
So in other
It's
words,
not-
what's different about what you're doing is you're trying to go around this regulation that only allows state radio to broadcast over the radio airwaves and effectively have radio via the internet by different people or different people who wouldn't have voices otherwise in rural India.
Yes, in our model, people use their phone to record their messages. We cross-check, verify, or what you call journalism. We do it on internet, and it goes back to them through their mobile phone only, which we should be ideally putting out on radio because mobile phone is expensive. To listening on mobile phone is very expensive. So it does not work as an economic model. But yes, that's what we would like to do. That can media be democratic? Can every voice has same respect as we have in political democracy?
Well, what are some of the difficulties that you've encountered in doing this project that some of the people who are doing this type of mobile phone-based citizen journalism have encountered?
So the first problem is legal, as I said, that to make this idea or a model a sustainable, replicable model, we need shortwave and medium wave radio. And we do not have even a provision to apply for a shortwave or medium wave radio here. We face different kind of problems like where we are in the middle of a civil war between communist, Maoist guerrillas and state or police. The guerrillas also do not like us because what is happening when people's voices are coming out, and we do have some good officers who are proactive and solves those problems. They do not like that, it looks. So we face problems from both sides. State don't like because they have managed the mainstream, the so-called mainstream media quite well. And when the stories come out of human rights violation, of corruption, which are not coming out because the journalist who is at the bottom gets all his salary or income as a cut of that advertisement he or she needs to collect. So they don't like when stories of corruption and human rights violation come out by citizen journalists using their mobile phone. And similarly, the people, those who are inside the forest, they also don't like when problems get solved, because if problems get solved, who will go to them? So we face problems from all sides.
Shubhanshu Chowdhury, thanks so much for joining us on the program. This is Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. This week, a look at threats to free expression and the press in India. We're going to pull in three other guests now for a broader look at this issue. Joining us from New York, Bob Dietz. He's the coordinator of the Committee to Protect Journalists Asia program. From Delhi, Karuna Nundi, an Indian Supreme Court lawyer and civil liberties advocate. And from Mumbai, Rishi Majumdar. He's a freelance journalist and the associate partner of a new media company called Oijo. He's also written for numerous different media outlets, including Yahoo, the newspapers Dawn, and The Hindu. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Rishi Majumdar, we did hear about some of the difficulties faced by journalists in these rural areas of India. What has your experience been? Do you see some of the same divide between how the media operates in rural areas and villages and how it operates in sort of India's big booming cities?
There's definitely a huge divide between how the media operates in the rural areas and in the metropolises. There's also a divide between how the media operates in the metropolises and the smaller towns and the tier 2 cities, so to speak. In fact, if you look at the killings of journalists this year, you'll find about six. You mentioned 6 cases that have been noticed by CPJ, and you see that most of the cases have been of journalists who have been killed in either small towns or rural Indias. So that should be telling.
Well, Karuna Nundi, I wanted to ask you about this incident that we mentioned earlier in which the government accused these 3 Indian television stations of violating broadcasting regulations for their reporting on a terrorist case. I think the offenses were along the lines of disrespecting the judiciary, disrespecting the office of the president. Tell us just a little bit about that case.
So that case was interesting. I mean, I think the government has, by various means, been sort of pulling out regulations and using existing law in particular ways to limit speech. So this example was one where, there was somebody who was convicted of a terrorist offense called Yaqub Memon. There was a death sentence that was passed against him, and his lawyer spoke on a few TV channels around the time.
So I'm sorry, so Yaqub Memon, he had been convicted of involvement in these 1993 bombings in Mumbai, is that correct?
That's exactly right. And his lawyer made some comments about a Supreme Court judgment, and he said that, of course, we are bound by the judgment, and the Supreme Court decided this in their wisdom. Now, cable television rules were sort of extracted, used, taken out of nowhere really, and sent to these 3 TV channels. And I was asked for advice in one of the cases. And look, it's clear, our contempt of court law is not great, but it's up to the judiciary, really, essentially. And it's very clear, and the cable television rules sort of seek to sort of shoot off the shoulders of the judiciary. And the judiciary is perfectly capable of taking care of itself.
So in other words, what occurred then is that there was the stations had aired criticism of the judicial rulings in the case after this man was executed then, is that correct?
Exactly, and we have an explicit law. The law of defamation actually very explicitly says that when there is a decided case and where there's a decided decision, that fair critique of it is explicitly allowed. So this is actually a great example of odd, unconstitutional powers being used to suppress speech.
Well, Bob Dietz of the Committee to Protect Journalists, give us just an overview of what your research shows. We have been talking about this case involving the Indian television channels. How does this fit into sort of the bigger context in India with regards to press freedom, freedom of expression over the past year or two?
I think this is typical, not just of India really, but of many countries around India and many countries around the world, frankly. In terms of journalists being killed, as Rishi had mentioned, more than 90% of all the journalists killed in the world are local journalists covering local stories, and that's not unique to India.
So these are like people saying like the local district officer is corrupt or this company is doing something illegal.
Taking on local strongman, taking on a corruption issue, taking on environmental issues, a very big, very dangerous area, logging or water abuse or mining. And it's really typical of much of the world. In terms of the government using legal methods to kind of suppress free speech. Again, not unique to India, but each country goes about it in their own way. In China, say, you see the use of state security laws and threatening state security, social stability, and these very wide, broad issues that are really hard